Back, would you like to move forward a bit? Bilal Tanweer is our moderator for this session. Bilal Tanweer is a writer and translator. His fiction, poetry and translations have appeared in various magazines including Granta, Valum, Critical Muslim, The Caravan and Words Without Borders. His first novel, The Scatter Here is Too Great, is being launched here at KLF. Thank you.
Okay, thank you and welcome everybody to the session called Literature and Identity, New Trends in Pakistani English Writing. My name is Bilal Tanweer. I have with us a panel of two wonderfully diverse and interesting panelists who are going to shed light upon this. I'm going to introduce them. So the way we're going to run this is very simple. I'm just going to introduce them, get out of the way. They're going to make their statements on this subject, maybe 5 to 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for questions. So we'll have about 10 minutes for your questions and answers. We have with us Rukhsana Ahmed, which is the lady in maroon. Rukhsana is a translator and a writer and a playwright. She has written and adapted several plays for the stage and radio, achieving distinction in both. River on Fire was a finalist for the Susan Smith Blackburn International Prize. Her first novel, The Hope Chest, was published by Virago. We Sinful Women, her pioneering translation of Urdu feminist poetry, is a widely acclaimed resource, particularly in the academia. The Gatekeeper's Wife and Other Stories is an anthology of her short fiction, which is forthcoming by Ilka. This is the publisher in Lahore, yeah? That's Readings. Okay. We have with us Claire Chambers to my left. Claire is a lecturer in global literature at the University of York, where she researches and teaches 20th and 21st century writing from South Asia, the Arab world, and their diasporas. She is the author of British Muslim fictions, interviews with contemporary writers and co-editors, and she's also the co-editor of the forthcoming essay collection Imagining Muslims in South Asia and the Diasporas. Claire is co-editor of the Journal of Commonwealth Literature and a columnist for Dawn's Books and Authors magazines. Her interest in the literature of the Indian subcontinent and the Muslim world was originally ignited by the year she spent in Peshawar. It continues to be informed by her visits to the region and by engagement with diasporic communities in Britain. She is currently completing a monograph entitled Representations of British Muslims 1966 to the Present. After that, she plans to write a book about Pakistani writing in English. So, as you can see, we have a highly qualified panel to talk about the subject. But personally speaking, when I sort of read this title, Identity, Literature and New Trends in Pakistani Writing in English, to be fair, I was unable to wrap my head around it. I just, I found it difficult. I found links that were not very clear to me. So I'm just going to ask Rukhsana to go first and then talk about it, and then maybe Claire will sort of take on from there.
Okay, thank you very much, Bilal, for that generous introduction. I'd also like to thank KLF for inviting us here. And I have to say that I'm actually... Am I too close to it? I'm actually going to take a stance on identity that might surprise you a little after the session on Karachiwala. I'm also Karachiwala by the way, but ethnically Punjabi. I was raised on Urdu as my first language. So I think the whole question of identity and diversity is a very complex one and a very interesting one for writers. I'll quote you Baba Bulle Shah ne. Bulla main ki jana main kaun. And I think I bring that poem up with a very particular reason. The whole poem is about Naam Muslim, Naam Kafir. That sort of he contests in it throughout that I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a heathen, I'm neither Moses nor Pharaoh, I'm not fire, I'm not water. But it ends on a very powerful note. He goes, I am the one who knows everything. I am the wise one. I am the beginning and I am the end. And I think this is the writer's position. Essentially, I take it as a statement that a writer adopts. So when you talk about identity in literature, you're going in exactly the opposite direction to what politicians want you to do. Identity as a composite and as a finite thing is something that only suits people who want to commodify you. It suits the state structure, it suits politicians, it suits commercial interests, it suits people who want to package you. So you might find your book in the black section or in the African section or the Asian section. Identity, in my view, is something that you can only apply to Pakistani mangoes and say with certainty, these are Pakistani mangoes, and when you give it a name, it'll be the same. And I mean, my position is exactly Bulle Shah's. I'm not born of Adam, and I don't have a name. Because when I write, as a writer, and I'm taking the inside view of identity as a writer, I adopt an identity for a particular work. It's the identity which kind of defines the meaning of the work in the end. It's the identity in which I want to locate myself if I'm writing a play. It's where I might locate my point of view. So I think that's largely my position on identity. I see that identity is a creative challenge. All definitions of identities that are imposed on writers from outside present a creative challenge and often become an incitement for work. And an interesting challenge, I think I came of age. There's a wonderful expression in Urdu, hosh mein aana, jab maine hosh sambhala. So I came of age as a writer in the 80s, and I think feminists were in their heyday, and identity issues were absolutely at the front of everything. People wanted black identity, women wanted their identity, gays wanted, their identity acknowledged. And I felt that, okay, we did that, identity discussions are over, but actually they're never over. You come to Pakistan and you find that you are again painted into a category. You are either a Shia or a Sunni, and there is no recognition of the fact that you might be neither. You are either a Punjabi or an Urduwala, and they don't understand that there can be people who are composites. So I suppose writers are born to challenge those conceptions. And it's interesting that even those oppressive identities have actually become like sand to an oyster. I'm very interested in the challenge that 9/11 has presented to Muslims, particularly in the West. I mean, I think women were fighting for the recognition of their identity because they were so low down the scale. The same is true of, let's say, what are rather horribly called slave narratives in the early 20th century that came out soon after the end of slavery. They were about, establishing some sense of who we are, who we have been. And now, once again, Muslims are being derided in the world, and particularly in the diaspora, you're very aware of the criticism that is constantly leveled at you, and that criticism is leveled at you here as well. And it's interesting that derision can become something that produces an interesting piece of work. I see Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist as one of the very interesting explications of identity. I think it incited even Kamla Shamsi and drew her into the subject. In Raza, the character that you see in Burnt Shadows has this kind of slide into terrorism. You have a terrorist figure in Nadeem Aslam's Maps for Lost Lovers, and he returns to it, of course, with much more seriousness and much more intensity in The Wasted Vigil. And I'm afraid I haven't read the latest book, but I think I went to a reading, and I think he's dealt with it again. But in the end, we all have to have our own opinion of a challenge, or if you like, our own response to a challenge. I've got here, and I I'm pleased to hear. This is not to cause you any blushes, Bilal. I believe you're launching this tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I haven't quite got to the end of it, but I've been reading it.
Okay.
And I'm very fascinated by the fact that here is a new generation of writers who are actually dealing with the results of violence in a much more visceral way. There's something very interesting in this book which started to happen in that little story that was probably the seed of it, which was in Life's Too Short, I believe. And that story is actually, again, reproduced in this collection. What Bilal has done here is quite interesting. He takes the scene of a bomb and slivers the form of the novel to explain, if you like, what's going on. Obviously, I'm not giving away any endings or doing anything like that, but what I wanted to say about this whole thing, this whole kind of body of literature growing about terrorism and identity books, is this a trend or is it not? Now, I'm afraid when it comes to trends, I feel it's much easier to talk of a trend in relation to books, in relation to shoes and in relation to clothes or fashion or even decor. But when it comes to books, they are a slow burn. It takes a very long time for a trend to happen. Yeah. So I think it's only in hindsight that a generation will be able to say, oh, at such and such time, a trend happened. I'm just going to also leave along another book. This is Muniza Shamsi's collection, And the World Changed, which presented the work of several women writers. And I would say that it was amazing to see that there were so many women writers writing in English. What has a real and incontestable reality is the fact that writing in English has grown exponentially. When I was a child, there were hardly any books written in English, original books written in English by Pakistani authors. I grew up on things like Ibn Safi and Chughtai and read a range of stuff quite indiscriminately, but also read a whole lot of Victorians, largely people like Dickens and George Eliot. But now, Pakistani children would have some books to choose from. It's interesting that some of the writers here, you saw, those of you who were here this morning, Uzma Aslam Khan won a prize today. And obviously there's a book here that has outshone people like Nadeem Aslam and Mohsen Hamid. So you have a growing body of work, if you like, from women. Are we going to call it a trend? On the other hand, women have been writing for the 30, 40 years gone before, and women have always been writing. It's interesting that an author might start her career like Doris Lessing and write for 60 years. So is she a trend? At what point was she part of a trend? People like Atwood and her. And, so what I'm saying is people who continue to write over a long period of time may or may not seem part of the trend. But we're all dealing with the same issues. Ultimately, what's more interesting for writers is not so much identity as experience. Yeah. Now, I don't know, I might have overrun my time, so I'm worried.
This is perfect. Your point perfect.
Okay,
thank you. Thank you, Rukhsana. Claire, would you want to weigh in?
Well, I'm really glad, Rukhsana, that you talked about identity, because that was something I felt I didn't really want to do because I'm not Pakistani. And the Egyptian author Nawal al-Saadawi has an essay called Why Keep On Asking Me About My Identity? It's a bit like white people have no identity or they don't notice their own identity and they ask others all the time about their identity. So I'm steering clear of that topic. I think Bilal is right that there's quite a lot of words scattered in our titles, so I'm going to stick to the part that's about new trends in Pakistani writing. And again, in some ways, I feel like an imposter because although I've been frantically buying books ever since I got here, living in Britain, I don't always have the most up-to-date text, so you might forgive me if I'm about 2 years behind here. But I suppose the first thing I wanted to say is something that was very interesting in the previous panel I was involved in. The American Pakistani academic Amir Mufti was talking about what this rise of the English novel has done to Urdu literature, and how the global demand for the novel was really affecting Urdu that has always had such an emphasis on the short story. So not being an Urdu specialist, it's something I just want to mention, but I think it is important. And also I think it is important to realise that obviously even Pakistani writing in English, which is quite a young tradition, has nonetheless had a lot of good fiction writers for a long time. Think about people like Zulfikar Ghosh, but obviously Bapsi Sidwa, Hanif Qureshi in the diaspora, and then in the realm of memoir, sort of autobiographical fiction, if you like, Sara Saleri. And in the UK, Ahmed Hussein, Rukhsana Ahmed, and lots of others have been around for a long time. But it's interesting to me that something seems to have happened around the year, let's say, 1971, where I feel as though around that year, a whole group of new writers were born, around the early 70s to maybe the mid-70s, same sort of age that I am. It's interesting that a lot of these upcoming writers are all about the same age. Bilal, I think you're quite a bit younger than us. But it just seems that there's a bigger group of writers. We do hear a lot about what's sometimes called the Big Five, who are mostly men. Daniel Moenuddin, Mohsen Hamid, Nadim Aslam these two have been mentioned. Muhammad Hanif, who was on the human rights panel, of course, and then the only woman in the Big Five being Kamala Shamsi. And of course, these are really important, great writers. And I'm glad that Rukhsana has highlighted the fact that many women writers, Usma Aslam Khan, Bina Shah, Soraya Khan, they're also writing and doing great work, sometimes less well celebrated and less well heralded on the international stage at least. But I do think this group of 1970s writers are growing in confidence. And I mean, just as a digression, I chose the year 1971 obviously quite deliberately, because I do think that this generation, even though they don't remember the Civil War and the succession of Bangladesh, have been shaped by it. And one of the things, the trends, if you like, that I notice amongst this new generation of writers is actually a turn to a sort of historical novel, quite recent history. So there are a lot of writers looking back on 71. And an American academic with the same initials as me, Kara Solano, has written a whole book on Pakistani writing, reflecting Pakistani fiction and poetry, I think, but mostly fiction, reflecting on 1971. We know that cartography, Bapsi Sidwa, cartography by Kamala Shamsi has, as part of that, it is quite interested in looking back on what that rift meant for Karachiites. And there have been many novels looking back on 1971, but also looking back on the Zia years. Some of the younger writers too, not from the 70s generation, but people like Ali Sethi, who's born in the 80s, I think. He reflects on the Zia years, even though I think he can probably hardly remember them. And I examined a PhD by a Pakistani studying at the University of Lancaster. She called these kinds of novels, she had a name for it, precursors to 9/11 novels, she called them, where she argues that the writers are looking back at recent history and looking at where the seeds were sown. The Afghan Mujahideen issue that is explored in Shamsi's Burnt Shadows, where the Raza, who you mentioned, gets involved and travels up to Afghanistan, passes as a Hazara. So sort of recognising that the war on terror didn't come from nowhere, that the seeds were sown through earlier generations. But I also think as this group gains in confidence, this younger generation grows in confidence, I see increase of interest, a turning inwards and an interest in form increasingly. And I'm sorry to embarrass you again, Bilal, but your book is one of the ones that does this really beautifully. The scatter here is too great. I mean, because I reviewed this recently, so it's uppermost of my mind. I spent much of the review trying to work out what to call this book. Is it a collection of short stories? It feels like a novel. There's patternings, there's interconnections about different characters who are converge where the bomb takes
Yeah,
place.
there is an identity crisis there.
Yeah. And you're not the only one. I think there's a lot of interest in form. I think also what I'm interested in is that as Pakistani writing in English is proliferating, there's a turn to genre fiction. We've seen this in India 10, 20 years ago, and now Pakistan is increasingly doing this with, we've got chick lit, I suppose this is high-class literary chick lit, I'm happy to say, but things like Moni Mohsin's Diary of a Social Butterfly, which I found hilarious, and there's always a political edge in Pakistani chick lit, which makes, for me, a much more interesting read. Maha Khan Phillips' book, Beautiful from This Angle, is very clever chick lit, and I'm really looking forward to Sabah Imtiaz's book on Karachi, something, I can't remember.
You're killing me.
You're killing me. I'm looking. I thought I could buy it, but I'm sorely disappointed. Someone will have to send me a copy. But also, so we've got crime fiction as well. I just bought The Prisoner. There's this medical thriller whose name escapes me. So I know that Urdu has a long tradition of crime and detective fiction, but this is now appearing in English. I wonder what will happen with this. In India, it's huge. Since the opening up of the economy and the rise of small publishers and big publishers alike in India, we've seen an explosion of genre fiction. There's even new genres the Indians are inventing, like alumni fiction, which is different from Western campus fiction in that it's more focused on the students the young people having their stresses about exams, they're going to IIT and studying, working really hard, also socialising and breakups and makeups and all this kind of thing. Chetan Bhagat would be a good example of that in India. Also the genre that Emma Dawson-Verghese, the academic, calls cricklet. So a whole sort of new genre around cricket and the IPL. So I'm just really interested in terms of future currents of what will happen to this rise of genre fiction and almost what you could say pulp. It would be exciting if Pakistan could start inventing its new genres. Certainly, I think it's already genre blending with what it's doing with chick lit, and I'm sure with the crime fiction here. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Claire. And I think that it's very interesting. I mean, the things that both of you have said together in your own ways. What Rukhsana, you were talking about identity as a creative challenge. And what Claire mentioned as this, looking inward of new writing, more concerned with the form. Because I think one of the things that form allows you to do is that it allows you to solve many problems of content itself, right? So, there are many silences in your histories that are hard to illuminate if you do, but, allowing those silences to creep up by using form, by using a particular form that allows people to think about those questions, that raises those questions in the shape of the work itself. So again, many thoughts. We're just going to open it up. We have maybe 5 minutes. Okay, and then you, yeah.
I just have. You mentioned a medical thriller. I think you meant Breath of Death by Saad Shafqat. Was that the book?
Say it again.
You mentioned a medical thriller that's recently come out in Pakistan. I think you meant Saad Shafqat's Breath of Death.
That's right.
Yeah. It's got a pill on the front cover.
Yes,
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Sorry, the name's lit.
I just wanted
Thank
to-
you. That's great.
Oh. That's it? Okay. There's a question here and then we can go back to Haris. Oh.
Thank you very much, Rukhsana, for that very informed and scholarly discourse. With due respect, I do beg to differ on your interpretation of Bulleh Shah. sort of felt that it was very reductionist. When Bulleh Shah refers to the self, he's referring to the higher self. And higher self in the discourse of Bulleh Shah refers to the logocentric reliance on the transcendental other.
Absolutely. I agree with you.
So to kind of, obviously you're resurrecting the author. You're contesting the notion of the death of the author. I can understand that. But to reduce it to what Bulleh Shah has to say, to interpret it in that way perhaps is not doing justice to Bulleh Shah. So I think it's important to clarify that.
I do clarify it. Yeah. In my written text, I do clarify it. I say that it's a Sufi text, and obviously it's a very multi-layered meaning, and we can all take from it several meanings. But I was using the phraseology as the perfect phraseology to say, because actually Sufis also have the same mystique, and to which several writers and many poets lay claim. If you're a non-believing writer, that is the mystique that you call upon. That you yourself is the authority, your real self.
Yeah, but
it's a material self as opposed to the spiritual self. And I'm really grateful for that clarification. Thank you.
No, I just felt that to secularize a discourse, especially a Sufi discourse, which is rooted in the sacred, needs to be. You need to clarify that it is a secular discourse that you're imposing, and that is not necessarily how a Sufi text can be read. It can be.
I would say that I need the space to be secular.
Okay, can we go back to Haris Ghazdar, please?
Thank you. I find, Claire, I think your observation very insightful. I think that the date that you've picked up on, it has, and I think the question I'm going to ask to all three of you actually, not just the two of you, this date has something to do with it. The question is that if you look at Pakistan now, it's a country of about 180 million people, and at most, maybe 2 or 3% of this population has facility in the English language. So, still a big number because it's a big country. 2 or 3% of 180 million is still a medium-sized country in Europe. So, the question is that, is it a problem that some of our most gifted minds, and they are really gifted minds, and if we are moving into a situation where we can actually have multiple genres developing. So it means that, a literary tradition is coming into being. But is it a problem for a society? Not for these authors, because people will write in the metaphors and in the languages that they are comfortable with, and they should. But is it a problem for a country where maybe 2 or 3% of the population have facility in a language in which its most gifted writers produce work?
I mean, it's a problem. What you've seen in India with the explosion of pulp writing is these texts are very difficult for non-Indians or certainly non-South Asians to understand, because they are pretty much, although they're written in English script, they are have absolutely loads of Hindi words scattered amongst them. So they are insiders' books written by Indians for Indians, and they don't find their way, for the most part, outside the country. I think there is a higher proportion in India now with facility in English. So I don't know if the same thing will happen in Pakistan. I also think there's a whole problem around infrastructure and publishing houses in this country that needs to be addressed, because most Pakistani writers are being published in India first. It is a shame. It is a difficulty that, as you say, the greatest, some of the best minds are choosing to write in English. Some of them have no choice. One of Amir Hussein's characters says, you don't choose the language you write in, it chooses you. So if English is the language of your education, you might be very confident speaking Urdu, but you may not have the vocabulary to write in. So for some, it is there is no choice. For others, it is a decision, and it does, obviously there are pragmatic reasons involved in that decision, not least the global market. So yes, I do think there are problems here. My lack of Urdu means that it's the Anglophone text that I tend to access, although I do read quite a lot in translation as well. I think it's good that a festival like this does have, a strong strand of Urdu and regional languages, but Rukhsana might be able to add more to this.
Should I? Yes. I strongly contest the idea that there is a deep conflict between writers who are between the interests of English and the interests of regional languages. I think there's been there are some terrific writers in each of our regional languages, and I think that will always continue, because the choice of English is very much to do with class. It's to do with a post-colonial educational system which has kind of given English to a few people, a handful of people as the medium of instruction, and the majority go to Urdu medium schools or regional language schools, perhaps in some areas. I don't know much about the educational system here anymore, having migrated 40 years ago. But I think that just because a minority speaks it, just because it's seen to be perhaps a more lucrative business with a wider audience, is not necessarily the reason why writers will choose it. Writers are often constrained by their lives. I doubt if you can say that the best writers will be writing in English. Who knows? I think the best writing might come from the regions. It often does.
So, Haris, I'm just going to, I know it's bad manners, but I'm just going to ask a counter question, because I think it's a serious question. When you ask, is it a problem? My question is, problem for who, right? Because it's certainly a problem for the policymakers. I see that, right? But I'm not sure if it's a problem necessarily for writers, because I think you agreed with that writers are going to write in the language that they're most comfortable in. And I think that also I incline toward what Rukhsana was saying, because what Professor Amir Mufti was saying this morning, that because of English, other languages have been marginalized. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that those languages are just there, except, the only difference is that English gets far more exposure than, and far more money is involved in writing in English. The kind of advances you can claim for a novel in English, you cannot even, and in terms of, readability of that language, readability of literary language, if you think about it a little more specifically, I would ask you, how many people are reading Afzal Saab, right? Afzal Ahmed Sayyid, who's sitting right there, one of our finest poets. His work is in Urdu, right? But again, I don't think he sells in many thousands of copies. How many people are reading Ghalib, for instance? So again, I think that we need to think more specifically about these issues, how many people are actually reading literary language, right? There is a large consumption of non-literary language, of pulp narratives, of certain kinds of narratives, but really, if you really think about it, narratives that really challenge us, both in terms of language, in terms of form, and in terms of content. How many serious consumers and takers are there in, for instance, Urdu language? If you go by the sales, there are not too many, right? So again, I think that this question really needs to be thought about much more seriously than, simply as a pitting against English versus Urdu. I think a dichotomy, again, as Rukhsana is saying, is not really helpful in really helping us thinking about literature and, serious engagement with literature. Okay, so I think we are out of time. One more question? Okay, we have room for one more question.
Can I ask?
Go for it.
Oh, my question is for Rukhsana Ahmed. I want to ask how literature and identity are related. Because I read Kamila Shamsi's Salt and Saffron, and it says like the granddaughter slept the grandmother.
Sorry?
in Kamila Shamsi's Salt and Saffron, I was quite shocked to read that. It says like the granddaughter slapped the grandmother. And similarly in Mohsin Hamid's Moth Smoke, it again talked about extramarital affairs. And a guy, he's like out of this, like what can I say, very rich, very, very rich. And I don't think these rich people are here in Pakistan. And again, I read one of the short stories of Daniel Muhyiddin, and it talked about rape, women's sexual desires, and these things are taboo. I don't think like we can discuss these things in Pakistan. So do you really think like the South Asian literature or the Pakistani literature depict our identity, which is Pakistani, like we are Pakistani, and I don't expect these things to be in a Pakistani literature.
Like, sorry, so, you know, like, so which one of these things don't actually happen in Pakistan? Like, all the things that you've mentioned, like, which one doesn't happen?
I think these three of these things doesn't happen.
Don't happen?
Yeah.
Okay, let's start from there.
I would beg to differ. You see, I think all these subjects have been tackled in Urdu stories as well. I would say, and certainly rape is a constant problem. Sexual desire is a reality, and if it is not acknowledged, you get a lot of mentally ill people. And that's what is happening quite a lot in our culture as well, sadly. The mental abuse that happens over here, the sexual abuse that happens over here, all of these problems need to be discussed. Just because we've had a society that's been so coy and so inhibited and so reluctant to be honest about its own faults, we can't say that this is a problem that English is importing into it. This is a reality.
There's a whole culture in a language. There's a whole culture in a language, and I just feel that it's very positional, it's a construct.
Do we want to wait for the...
Okay, can you keep the comment short? Yeah. This is the final question. We're going to close after this. Okay.
I can relate with what...
Is it here? This is the lady, actually.
I can relate with what the young lady had to contribute to this, because I think it's very pertinent. English does kind of decontextualize certain issues. It does create a certain cultural distancing. It does create a certain control. And I feel that it does bring a certain construct which controls social norms and practices. So I think it's to be critical of the milieu that we reside in. I think is a very healthy thing.
Sure.
But to use a critical lens, which a particular language that is rooted within a certain culture, that we cannot deny, I think needs to be understood and used and manipulated and appropriated with caution. I hate to moralize on this, but perhaps because since you were also moralizing on it, I thought that we needed to strike a balance.
Okay.
And thank you very much for
Thank
this.
you. Thank you for that. And thank you all for coming. It was nice seeing you all here. Thank you, Rukhsana, and thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.